As Rose travelled back towards the village, her mind raced with possibilities. The coordinated nature of the animal attacks, their unnatural ferocity. This was no ordinary wildlife gone rogue. There was intelligence behind this, a malevolent purpose. The journey back to the village was harrowing. The once peaceful forests now seemed to pulse with a dark, threatening energy. Rose found herself jumping at every rustling leaf, every snapping twig. The woods, which had once been a source of solace for her, now felt like a sinister alien place. It wasn't just the larger animals that seemed affected, even the insects seemed to swarm with unusual aggression. Clouds of biting flies and stinging wasps harried Rose as she travelled, forcing her to use her fire magic to create a shimmering, heated barrier around herself. By the time she reached the outskirts of the village, Rose was exhausted, her nerves frayed. But the sight that greeted her pushed all thoughts of fatigue from her mind. The village was in ruins. Houses were reduced to splinters, their thatch roofs scattered like straw in the wind. The streets were gouged with deep claw marks, and the coppery scent of blood hung heavy in the air. Rose's heart in her throat. She had expected damage, but this was total devastation. She moved through the eerily quiet streets, her senses on high alert for any sign of the villagers or their attackers. As she neared the centre of the village, Rose began to hear voices, cautious, hopeful voices calling out names, searching for loved ones. She rounded a corner and found a group of villagers gathered in what had once been the village square. They were bruised, bloodied, but alive. Relief flooded through Rose, followed quickly by a renewed sense of determination. She approached the group, calling out to get their attention. Over the next few hours, Rose listened as the villagers recounted their harrowing experiences. They spoke of the animals' unnatural behaviour, of the strange green light that seemed to glow in their eyes. They described how the creatures had seemed to be working together, herding the villagers like prey. But what truly caught Rose's attention was a detail mentioned by several of the villagers independently. They spoke of seeing cloaked figures in the woods just before the attacks began. Figures that seemed to be chanting, their words lost in the wind. Rose's suspicions crystallized into certainty. This was magic, dark and twisted. Someone or something was controlling these animals, using them as weapons. But for what purpose? Why attack this peaceful, unassuming village? As Rose pondered this question, one of the villagers, an elderly man named Giles, approached her. He had been the village's chief hunter and knew the woods better than anyone. "Miss Rose," he said, his voice low and urgent, "there's something you should know. In my younger days, I used to venture deep into the forest, far beyond our usual hunting grounds. And in those deep places I found strange rocks, crystals that glowed with an inner light." Rose leaned forward, her interest piqued. "Go on." "I didn't think much of it at the time," Giles continued, "but lately I've been hearing rumours. Whispers of rare minerals found in these parts, minerals that could fetch a high price from the right buyer." Rose's mind raced. Rare minerals, cloaked figures, animal attacks driving villagers from their homes. It was all starting to make a horrifying kind of sense. "Giles," she said, her voice grim, "I think someone is trying to drive you all off your land. They want these minerals, and they're willing to resort to dark magic to get them." The old hunter nodded, his face etched with worry. "What can we do, Miss Rose? We're just simple village folk. We can't fight against magic." Rose stood, her hand resting on her whip. "You don't have to. That's why I'm here." She turned to face the villagers, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "Listen to me. I know you're scared. I know you've suffered. But I promise you, I will get to the bottom of this. I will find out who is behind these attacks, and I will make them pay." The villagers looked at her with a mix of hope and trepidation. They had seen Rose's skills as a mediator, but could she really stand against such dark forces? Rose saw their doubt, and it only fueled her determination. "I am Rose," she declared, her eyes blazing with an inner fire. "The guardian of flames, and I will not rest until your village is safe, and those responsible are brought to justice." With those words, Rose turned and strode towards the edge of the village, towards the dark, menacing woods that had once been her sanctuary. As Rose made her way through the dense undergrowth, following the directions Giles had provided, she couldn't shake the sense of unease that clung to her like a second skin. The forest, which had once been a place of peace and rejuvenation for her, now felt hostile, as if the very trees were watching her with malevolent intent. The further she ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The canopy overhead seemed to block out more light than it should, casting everything in a sickly greenish gloom. The air was thick and heavy, filled with the cloying scent of rotting vegetation and something else, something that made Rose's nose wrinkle in distaste. It was the smell of corruption, of nature twisted out of balance. Even the sounds of the forest seemed wrong. The usual chatter of birds and insects was replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of leaves set Rose's nerves on edge, her hand twitching towards her whip in anticipation of an attack. But no attack came. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like hours of trekking through the oppressive wilderness, Rose finally reached the area Giles had described. It was a small clearing, unremarkable except for the fact that the trees around it seemed to lean away, as if repelled by some unseen force. In the centre of the clearing, the ground was torn up, as if by some great beast's claws, and there, glinting in the dim light, were the crystals Giles had mentioned. Rose approached cautiously, her senses on high alert. The crystals were unlike anything she had ever seen. They were a sickly green colour, pulsing with an inner light that seemed to wax and wane like a heartbeat. The air around them shimmered with heat haze, though Rose could feel no warmth emanating from them. As she drew closer, Rose felt a sudden wave of nausea wash over her. The crystal's pulse seemed to synchronize with her own heartbeat for a moment, and she felt a sickening sense of wrongness, as if her very life force was being drawn towards the glowing stones. She took a step back, shaking her head to clear it. This was powerful magic, dark and twisted. She could feel it tugging at her, trying to worm its way into her mind. With an effort of will, Rose tore her gaze away from the crystals and began to examine the clearing more closely. The torn earth, the repulsive aura, the unnatural silence, all of it pointed to one thing. This was the epicenter. This was where the dark magic controlling the animals was emanating from. Rose's eyes narrowed as she spotted something half buried in the churned-up dirt. She knelt, brushing away the soil to reveal a scrap of fabric, dark green and heavy. It was the same material on the cloaked figures in the villagers' descriptions. A grim smile twisted Rose's lips. She had them now. Whoever was behind these attacks, they had left a trail. And Rose was an excellent tracker. She stood, tucking the scrap of fabric into her belt. She would analyze it later, see if she could glean any more information from it. But for now, she had a more pressing task. She needed to find these cloaked figures, these dark mages who thought they could prey on the innocent for their own gain. She needed to put an end to their scheme before more lives were lost and more villages destroyed. Rose took one last look at the sickly green crystals, her resolve hardening. She would get to the bottom of this. She would find out what these minerals were and why someone was willing to resort to such vile methods to obtain them. And then she would make them pay. With a final determined nod, Rose turned and began to make her way out of the clearing, back into the waiting forest. She had a hunt to begin. She had a job to do. And heaven help anyone who stood in her way. As Rose turned to leave the clearing, a thought struck her. These crystals were clearly the key to the dark magic at work here. If she could study one, perhaps she could understand more about how they were being used. She approached the nearest crystal cautiously, remembering the sickening sensation from before. But as she reached out and picked it up, she was surprised to find that the feeling of wrongness had diminished. The crystal still pulsed with an inner light, but it no longer felt malevolent. Rose frowned, turning the crystal over in her hands. It was as if the proximity to the others had been amplifying its effects, but once removed, it became more neutral. An idea began to form in her mind. She had seen similar phenomena before with enchanted objects. When placed near certain amplifying agents, their magical effects could be boosted to incredible levels. If these crystals were acting as amplifiers, Rose's eyes widened. That would explain the scale of the animal attacks, the level of control the dark mages seemed to have. They weren't just using magic, they were supercharging it. But that also meant that the mages themselves likely had some kind of artifact or device that was the source of the control magic. The crystals were just the enhancers. Rose tucked the crystal carefully into her pouch. She would need to study it further, but this was a major breakthrough. If she could find the device the mages were using and separate it from the crystals, she might be able to break their control over the animals. With renewed determination, Rose set off into the forest once more. She had a trail to follow, and now she had a clearer idea of what she was up against. As she trekked through the undergrowth, Rose's mind raced with the implications of her discovery. Amplification magic was tricky and often unstable. Whoever these mages were, they were playing with forces they might not fully understand. But Rose understood all too well. She had seen the consequences of unchecked magical ambition, had witnessed the destruction it could cause. She thought of Eldemire, of the chaos that had been unleashed there by those seeking power without wisdom. She wouldn't let that happen here. She wouldn't let innocent lives be destroyed for the sake of greed and dark ambition. Rose gripped her whip tighter, feeling the comforting weight of the leather-kiss armor against her skin. She was ready for this fight, ready to face whatever dark forces lay ahead. Rose made her way back to the village, the strange crystals safely tucked away in her pouch. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her since entering the forest. The woods, once a place of solace and peace, now felt tainted, as if the very trees were whispering dark secrets. When she arrived at the village, Rose was struck once again by the extent of the destruction. But there was no time to dwell on it. She had work to do. She headed straight for the cabin she had once called home. It was one of the few structures still standing, though its windows were shattered and its door hung off its hinges. Rose stepped inside cautiously, her senses on high alert. To her surprise, she found the cabin wasn't empty. Huddled in the corner were two figures, a man and a woman, their clothes torn and their faces streaked with dirt and blood. They looked up as Rose entered, fear and desperation in their eyes. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice hoarse, "please don't hurt us." Rose held up her hands in a calming gesture. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said softly. "I'm here to help. I'm Rose. I used to live here." The couple exchanged a glance, something like hope flickering across their faces. "Rose," the man said. "The mediator, the one who solved all those disputes." Rose nodded. "That's me. But right now, I'm here to solve a bigger problem. The animal attacks, the dark magic in the forest. I'm going to stop it." The woman let out a choked sob. "It's been horrible," she said. "The animals, they've gone mad. And the figures in the woods, chanting, always chanting." Rose knelt beside them, her voice gentle but urgent. "The figures? Did you see where they went? Could you lead me to them?" The man shook his head. No, we couldn't. It's too dangerous, but..." He hesitated, glancing at his companion. "Tell her, Yorn," the woman urged. "Tell her what you saw." Jorn took a deep breath. 2 nights ago, he said, I was out in the woods trying to find food. I saw a group of the cloaked ones heading north. They were carrying something that glowed. Rose's heart raced. Glowed, like a pulsing green light. Dawn's eyes widened. Yes, exactly like that. How did you know? Rose pulled out the crystal she had taken from the clearing. In the dim light of the cabin, its pulsing glow was even more unsettling. The couple recoiled at the sight of it. That's it, Yawn whispered. That's what they were carrying. Rose tucked the crystal away, her mind racing. North. The mages were heading north, and they were taking more of these crystals with them. She stood, a plan already forming. Thank you, she said to the couple. You've helped more than you know. Stay here, stay hidden. I'll come back for you when it's safe. With that, Rose turned and strode out of the cabin, purpose in every step. She had a direction now, a lead to follow. But first, she needed to prepare. The cabin would serve as her base of operations, a place to plan and regroup. She would need supplies, resources, and most of all, more information. As she set about fortifying the cabin, Rose's mind was already miles ahead, racing through the dark woods, chasing the trail of the cloaked figures. They had the advantage of numbers, of dark magic, of the twisted power of the crystals. As she worked, Rose's mind was constantly turning over the new information she had gathered. The cloaked figures heading north, the glowing crystals they carried. It all pointed to a larger operation, a coordinated effort to control the animals and drive the villagers from their homes. But the question remained, why? What did these dark mages hope to gain? And how were they able to wield such powerful magic? Rose knew she needed more information, and she knew just where to start looking. She set out into the woods once more, this time heading towards the northern edge of the village. According to Yawn, this was the direction the cloaked figures had been travelling. If she could pick up their trail, perhaps she could follow them to their base of operations. As she moved through the trees, Rose kept the crystal she had taken close at hand. She had a feeling it would be important, a key to unravelling the mystery of the mage's power. The forest seemed to grow darker and more oppressive the further north she went. The trees here were older, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their leaves blocking out nearly all sunlight. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and something else, something sharp and acrid that made Rose's nose itch. And then she saw it. A faint trail leading deeper into the woods, marked by trampled undergrowth and broken branches. It was a path that had been used recently, and used often. Rose's pulse quickened. This had to be it. This had to be the way the mages had gone. She followed the trail cautiously, all her senses on high alert. The forest around her was unnaturally quiet, the usual sounds of birdsong and insect chirps conspicuously absent. Even the air seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The trail led her deeper and deeper into the woods, into a part of the forest she had never explored before. The trees here were strange, their bark a sickly grey colour, their leaves a dull, lifeless green. And among their roots, Rose began to see more of the glowing crystals growing like malignant tumours from the earth. She was getting close. She could feel it. And then, through the trees ahead, she saw it. A clearing, much larger than the one she had found before, and in the centre of it, a sight that made her blood run cold. A great, pulsing mass of the crystals, towering like a grotesque tree. And around it, chanting in a language that made Rose's skin crawl, were the cloaked figures. She had found them, the heart of the dark magic, the source of the corruption that was poisoning the forest and driving the animals to madness. Rose gripped her whip tighter, the leather-kiss armour suddenly feeling heavier on her shoulders. This was it. This was the moment she had been preparing for. She took a deep breath, centering herself, and then, with a fierce cry, she burst into the clearing, fire already dancing along the length of her whip. As Rose charged into the clearing, the cloaked figures whirled to face her, their chanting rising to a fevered pitch. The air crackled with dark energy, the crystals pulsing in response to their words. Rose didn't hesitate. She lashed out with her whip, sending a wave of flame towards the nearest mage. But before it could connect, a wall of thorny vines burst from the ground, intercepting the fire. Rose's eyes widened. The mages were using the forest itself as a weapon. She had no time to dwell on this realization as a pack of snarling wolves emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing with the same sickly green light as the crystals. Rose turned to face them, her whip a blur of motion as she fought to keep their snapping jaws at bay. But the wolves were just the beginning. From the trees came a lumbering bear, its fur matted with blood and its roar echoing unnaturally through the clearing. Squirrels chittered angrily from the branches, their small eyes filled with unnatural malice. And then, to Rose's utter disbelief, a fluffy white rabbit hopped into the fray, its nose twitching furiously. It would have been comical if not for the fact that the creature was radiating the same dark energy as the other animals. Rose found herself fighting on all fronts, her whip and her fire magic barely keeping the onslaught at bay. The mages continued their chanting, the crystals glowing brighter with each passing second. She knew she had to get to them, had to break their concentration and shatter their control over the animals. But every time she tried to advance, the forest itself seemed to rise up against her, vines and branches blocking her path. Rose gritted her teeth, calling on every ounce of her skill and power. She sent a blast of fire scorching through the underbrush, clearing a path towards the mages. She vaulted over the enraged bear, using its back as a springboard to launch herself towards her target. But just as she was about to reach the chanting figures, a new threat emerged from the tree line, a creature unlike anything Rose had ever seen. A monstrous amalgamation of plant and animal, with glowing crystal eyes and a body that seemed to be made of living wood. It let out a roar that shook the earth, and Rose felt a wave of despair wash over her. How could she possibly fight something like this? But then, as the creature lumbered towards her, Rose's eyes fell on the pulsing mass of crystals at the center of the clearing, the source of the mage's power, the heart of the corruption that had taken hold of the forest. She knew what she had to do. With a fierce battle cry, Rose charged straight for the crystal mass, dodging the monster's grasping limbs and the mage's magical attacks. She poured all her power, all her fire, into her whip, feeling the leather-kiss armor heat up with the intensity of her magic. And then, with a final desperate lunge, she plunged her hand into the center of the crystals and released all her power in a single devastating blast. The explosion rocked the clearing, sending a shockwave of fire and magic rippling outwards. The mages screamed as their power source shattered, the crystals crumbling to dust in Rose's grip. And all around, the animals suddenly stopped, the green light fading from their eyes. They looked around, dazed and confused, before slinking back into the forest as if waking from a bad dream. Rose stood amidst the settling dust, her chest heaving and her armor scorched. But as she looked around at the now silent clearing, at the mages lying unconscious at her feet, she felt a grim sense of satisfaction. She had done it. She had broken their control, shattered their power. The forest and the village were safe. But as she stood there, victorious but exhausted, Rose couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The mystery of the crystals, of the dark magic that had taken root here, was far from solved. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that her work here was far from over. Rose approached the unconscious mages cautiously, her senses still on high alert despite the battle being over. She knelt beside the nearest one and pulled back their hood, revealing a face she didn't recognize. A quick check confirmed that all of the mages were strangers, not locals from the village or anyone she had encountered before. She began to search through their robes, looking for any clues as to their identity or purpose. In an inner pocket of one of the mages, she found a small leather-bound book. Rose flipped it open, her eyes scanning the pages. It appeared to be a journal of sorts, filled with handwritten notes and diagrams. The language was arcane and complex, but Rose's extensive experience with magical texts allowed her to decipher the general meaning. The mages, it seemed, were part of a larger organization, a cult dedicated to harnessing the power of these strange, amplifying crystals. The notes spoke of the crystal's ability to enhance magical abilities to an incredible degree, allowing the wielder to control beasts, influence the elements, and even manipulate the minds of the weak-willed. Rose's heart raced as she read on. The cult's ultimate goal, it appeared, was to gather as many of these crystals as possible and use their amplified power to establish dominion over the realms. The attack on the village, the manipulation of the animals, it had all been in service of this larger plan. But the journal also hinted at something else, a piece of the puzzle that Rose had been missing. The crystals, powerful as they were not the cult's only tool. There were references to an artifact, an ancient relic that could control the crystals, focusing and directing their power. Rose's mind flashed back to the monstrous creature that had appeared during the battle, the amalgamation of plant and animal that had radiated such dark power. Could that have been the relic the journal spoke of? She tucked the book into her pouch, her mind racing. She needed to know more, needed to understand the full extent of this cult's plans. But first, she had to deal with the immediate aftermath of the battle. Rose turned her attention back to the unconscious mages. She couldn't just leave them here. They needed to be secured, questioned. She needed to find out who they worked for, where their base of operations was. She began to search for something to bind them with, her mind still processing the information from the journal. The cult, the crystals, the mysterious relic. It all pointed to a threat far greater than she had initially realized. As she worked, Rose couldn't help but think about her own magic, the fire that had always been her specialty. She had studied the arcane extensively, had gained a deep understanding of magical theory and practice. But when it came to actual application, it was always fire that came most naturally to her. She thought back to her training, to the long hours spent honing her control over the flames. While others in the Order of the Grey had focused on mastering a wide range of magical disciplines, Rose had poured all her energy into perfecting her pyromancy. It had served her well over the years, her fire magic becoming a reliable and potent tool. But as she faced this new threat, Rose couldn't help but wonder if her specialization might also be a limitation. The cult's magic was diverse and adaptable, able to control beasts and manipulate the elements. Would her fire be enough to counter such varied abilities? She shook her head, banishing the doubts. She had faced countless challenges with her flames, had proven time and again that fire, when wielded with skill and precision, could overcome almost any obstacle. And she wasn't alone. She had her wits, her experience, and her unbreakable determination. She would unravel this mystery, would protect the innocent from the machinations of those who sought power at any cost. With renewed resolve, Rose finished binding the mages with sturdy vines and began the long trek back to the village, the weight of her new mission heavy on her shoulders. The battle was won, but the war, she feared, was just beginning. As Rose entered the village with the bound mages in tow, she was immediately surrounded by a crowd of angry villagers. They had suffered greatly at the hands of these dark magic users, and they were eager for justice. Rose raised her hands, calling for calm. She explained what she had discovered in the forest, the cult's plan to harness the power of the crystals for their own nefarious purposes. The villagers listened intently, their anger slowly turning to grim determination. They helped Rose secure the mages in a sturdy building that had survived the attack. Rose made sure they were tightly bound and well guarded before turning her attention to the next task at hand: interrogation. She studied the mages carefully, observing their body language, the way they interacted with each other. Even unconscious and bound, there were subtle signs that hinted at a hierarchy within their group. One mage in particular caught her eye. He was older than the others, his robes slightly more ornate, and when he finally regained consciousness, he had an air of authority about him, a subtle arrogance that suggested leadership. Rose approached him, her voice calm but firm. "You're the one in charge," she said. It wasn't a question. The mage sneered at her, his eyes filled with disdain. "You think you've won, don't you?" he spat. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Rose's eyes narrowed. "So enlighten me." Over the next several hours, Rose engaged in a battle of wits with the lead mage. He tried to mislead her, to send her down false trails and dead ends. But Rose's sharp mind and keen observation skills allowed her to separate the truth from the lies. Piece by piece, she put together a picture of the cult's operations. They had been seeking out the crystals for months, following ancient maps and obscure legends. The village had just been unfortunate enough to be situated near a particularly rich deposit. "And the relic?" Rose asked, remembering the references from the journal. "The artifact that can control the crystals." The mage's eyes widened slightly before he could control his reaction. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but the lie was obvious in his voice. Rose leaned in closer, her gaze intense. "Don't play games with me," she warned. "I saw it in the forest, the creature you summoned. That was the relic, wasn't it?" The mage remained stubbornly silent, but his lack of denial was confirmation enough. Rose sighed, leaning back. She had gotten all she could from this one. It was time to hand them over to the authorities. She made arrangements with the local guard, ensuring that the mages would be transported securely to face justice for their crimes. The villagers watched with grim satisfaction as their tormentors were led away in chains. But even as the immediate threat passed, Rose couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered. The cult was still out there, and if they had one relic, who knew how many more they might possess? She needed to find out more, to track down the source of these dark artifacts before they could be used to cause more harm. But first, she needed to help the village rebuild. They had suffered much, and Rose felt a responsibility to see them through this difficult time. As she set about organizing the rebuilding efforts, Rose's mind was already racing ahead, planning her next steps. The mages had been just the beginning. The true battle, she knew, was still to come, and Rose would be ready for it. Rose spent the next few days helping the village rebuild, using her skills and resources to organize the efforts. She worked tirelessly, directing the repairs, helping to distribute supplies, and providing comfort and support to those who had suffered. But even as she poured her energy into the rebuilding, Rose's mind never strayed far from the larger threat. The cult was still out there, and she knew she had to find them before they could cause more harm. Once she was satisfied that the village was on the path to recovery, Rose made her way back to the city. She used her contacts and her reputation to put together a shipment of supplies, food, medicine, building materials, to be sent back to the village. She wanted to ensure that they had everything they needed to fully recover from the attack. Back in the city, Rose began her investigation in earnest. She hit the streets, talking to her network of informants, following up on any lead, no matter how small. She started in the shadier parts of town, the places where dark magic and illicit activities tended to thrive. She visited seedy taverns, back-alley markets, anywhere that might attract those interested in the sort of power the crystals offered. For days, it seemed like she was chasing dead ends. The cult had covered their tracks well, and no one seemed to know anything about their activities. But Rose was nothing if not persistent. She kept digging, kept asking questions, until finally, she caught a break. It came in the form of a nervous-looking man in a dingy bar. Rose had been watching him for a while, noting the way his eyes darted around the room, the way he flinched at any sudden noise. When she approached him, he tried to bolt, but Rose was faster. She cornered him, using her imposing presence and reputation to intimidate him into talking. "I don't know much," he stammered, his hands shaking. "But I've heard whispers. About a group that meets in the old warehouse district. They talk about power, about changing the world. And they have these crystals." Rose's heart raced. This was it, the lead she'd been looking for. She pressed the man for more information, for any detail that might help her locate this group. He gave her a few more tidbits, a description of their leader, a rough location of their meeting place, before Rose let him go, disappearing back into the city streets. She had a location now, a place to start, but Rose knew she had to be careful. If this was indeed the cult, they would be on high alert after what happened in the village. She needed to plan her approach carefully to gather more information before making her move. But at least now she had a direction, a path forward in her hunt for the cult. As she made her way back to her lodgings, Rose's mind was already spinning with possibilities, with strategies and contingencies. She was close now. She could feel it. And when she found them, when she confronted the architects of this dark plot, there would be a reckoning. As Rose dug deeper into the cult's activities, she began to uncover disturbing hints of a larger network. Whispers of a group called the Black Dawn, an organization steeped in dark magic and connected to powers far beyond this realm. What was even more concerning were the murmurs about their interest in Earth, that mundane little realm that Rose had heard Silas speak of. Why would a group like the Black Dawn be interested in such a magically insignificant place? But the real shock came when Rose discovered the connection to Ultranacious. The name sent a chill down her spine, memories of Atherin and the terrible battle there flooding back. If Ultranacious was involved, even tangentially, the threat was far greater than Rose had initially realized. And if he got wind of her interference, Rose knew she had to be cautious. She couldn't risk a direct confrontation, not yet. She needed to gather more information, to learn the full extent of the Black Dawn's plans before she could make her move. So she changed her approach. Instead of hitting the streets herself, she started working through intermediaries, gathering intel and passing it along to the city guard. She used her network of contacts to keep tabs on the cult's activities, always staying one step removed from the action. It was frustrating at times, having to hold back when every instinct screamed at her to act. But Rose knew the value of patience, of waiting for the right moment to strike. Piece by piece, the picture began to come together. The Black Dawn was indeed planning something big, a move that would shake the very foundations of the realms. And at the center of it all was Earth. Rose didn't know the specifics of their plan, but she knew it boded ill for that unsuspecting realm. She had to find a way to stop them, to protect Earth from whatever dark designs the Black Dawn had in store. But she also knew she couldn't do it alone. As much as it galled her to admit it, she needed help. She needed the resources and manpower of the city guard, the backing of the authorities to take on a threat of this magnitude. So Rose continued her shadow campaign, feeding information to the guard, pointing them in the right direction. She used her skills and her knowledge to guide their efforts, always staying just out of sight. It was a delicate balancing act, and Rose knew the stakes were high. One wrong move, one misstep, and the Black Dawn would slip through her fingers, their plans coming to fruition with devastating consequences. But Rose was determined. She had faced impossible odds before and come out on top. She would do so again, no matter what it took.